The Cold War was defined by two massive military machines, but while they looked similar on a map, the reality inside the barracks was a world apart. In the United States, the post-Vietnam era saw a revolutionary shift to the all-volunteer force, where being a soldier became a respected profession of choice, attracting the best and brightest with the promise of high-tech training, competitive pay, and a clear path to a civilian career. The American military was a meritocracy of specialists, where the state invested millions in the survival and well-being of a single individual. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet military was a gigantic, state-run penal colony, a system of universal conscription where millions of young men were snatched from their homes and treated as disposable human resources to be ground up by the ideological mill. This fundamental clash between the professional warrior and the indentured serf is the reason why the U.S. emerged as a global leader in military ethics and technology, while the Soviet army became a hollow shell of fear and resentment, proving that a military that treats its own soldiers like cattle will eventually see those soldiers turn their backs when the empire starts to crumble. The contrast in the value of a life and tactical survival revealed a gap in technology that was rooted in morality. In the U.S., the 1980s saw a massive investment in protective gear, medical evacuation, medevac, and smart weapons designed to minimize friendly casualties. The American system viewed a soldier as a priceless asset whose loss was a national tragedy, leading to the development of Kevlar vests, advanced field medicine, and communication systems that kept every man connected to his unit. In the USSR, tactics were based on the meat wave philosophy, where the solution to any problem was simply to throw more bodies at it. Soviet soldiers were sent into battle with primitive medical kits, no body armor, and often without basic supplies like clean water or food. Because the state prioritized the production of 10,000 tanks over the survival of 10,000 men, this institutionalized indifference to death created a culture of fatalism and despair, where the Soviet soldier knew that to his commanders, he was nothing more than a statistic on a map. The role of Dedovshchina, hazing, and the culture of terror showed that the Soviet Army's greatest enemy was often within its own walls. In the U.S., military discipline was based on the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, a legal framework that protected soldiers from abuse and ensured that leadership was based on competence and rank, not physical torture. The American drill sergeant was a professional whose job was to build a team. In the USSR, the army was ruled by a prison hierarchy known as Dedovshchina, where senior conscripts were allowed and even encouraged to systematically beat, starve, and humiliate the new recruits. This wasn't just tough training. It was a state-sanctioned crime against humanity, resulting in thousands of suicides and murders every year that were officially covered up as accidents, a difference that turned the U.S. military into a brotherhood of pride and the Soviet military into a house of horrors where the main goal was not to defeat the enemy, but to survive your own comrades. The contrast in The Afghanistan Nightmare and The Lie of International Duty exposed the total disconnect between propaganda and reality in the U.S. While the Vietnam War was a traumatic failure, the lessons learned led to a culture of transparency and public accountability that eventually shaped the success of future operations. The American people demanded the truth about their wars. In the USSR, Afghanistan was a secret war fought by ghosts. Soviet conscripts were told they were going to plant trees and build schools in a friendly socialist nation, only to find themselves in a brutal 10-year meat grinder against a population that hated them. When the zinc coffins, Cargo 200, began to return to Soviet cities, the state forbade the families from even putting the word Afghanistan on their sons' tombstones. This cowardly denial of sacrifice was the ultimate betrayal of the soldier, proving that the party was more afraid of public opinion than it was saddened by the death of its youth. The final contrast in this first part is the technology of empowerment versus the technology of mass production, which defined the future of warfare. In the U.S., the soldier was equipped with the tools of the information age, night vision, satellite navigation, and laser-guided precision. Tools that made the individual soldier more powerful and more autonomous. The American system multiplied the power of the man. In the USSR, technology was a black box of mass-produced steel, where the individual was expected to be a simple operator of a machine that was often decades out of date. The Soviet tank was cramped, uncomfortable, and designed without any concern for the crew's survival in a hit, because the plan was to lose 5 tanks for every 1 American tank destroyed, a difference that meant the US was building a future of precision, while the Soviet Union was trapped in a past of attrition, a terminal flaw that would be exposed to the world when the high-tech American military swept aside Soviet-equipped armies in mere hours during the First Gulf War. The psychological war within the ranks was the silent killer of the Soviet military machine, a cancer that the United States had largely excised through the professionalization of its forces. In the US, the 1980s military culture was built on the foundation of leadership by example and mutual respect, where the officers' primary responsibility was the welfare and morale of their troops, creating a cohesive unit that functioned on trust rather than terror. The American NCO, non-commissioned officer, was the backbone of the system, an experienced professional who bridged the gap between the command and the soldiers, ensuring that orders were understood and that every man felt like a valued part of a winning team. In the USSR, the NCO Corps was non-existent, replaced by a brutal vacuum of power where sergeants were just conscripts with a few months more experience who used their rank to extort and torture those beneath them. This vacuum of professional leadership turned every Soviet barracks into a Lord of the Flies scenario, where the officers stayed in their private quarters to avoid the chaos, leaving the recruits to be broken by a system of tribal violence that ensured the army was a collection of traumatized individuals rather than a unified fighting force. The contrast in military justice and human rights revealed a system of law versus a system of arbitrary punishment. In the US, a soldier was still a citizen protected by the Constitution, with access to military lawyers, a formal grievance process, and a public eye that wouldn't tolerate systemic abuse. If an American commander mistreated their troops, they faced a court-martial and the end of their career. The American system was self-policing and transparent. In the USSR, the military prosecutor was a tool of the party, not a defender of the soldier. Thousands of cases of extreme violence, suicides with multiple gunshot wounds to the back, and deaths from untreated infections were simply filed away as accidents or desertions to protect the unit's statistics. This culture of impunity meant that for a Soviet parent, sending a son to the army wasn't a moment of pride, but a funeral in advance, as they knew their child was entering a lawless zone where the state had total power over their life and no accountability for their death. The role of the political commissar, Zampolit, and the surveillance state turned every unit into a nest of paranoia. In the US, the military was strictly apolitical, with a focus on tactical proficiency and loyalty to the Constitution rather than a political party. The chaplain or the counselor was there to provide spiritual or emotional support, not to report on your thoughts. The American soldier was free to have their own opinions as long as they followed orders. In the USSR, the Zampolit was the ideological watchdog, a man whose only job was to ensure that every soldier recited the party line and to report any seditious whispers to the KGB. This double chain of command created a nightmare of inefficiency, where tactical decisions were often overruled by political considerations and where soldiers were more afraid of saying the wrong word than they were of the enemy. A difference that made the US military a sword of the Republic and the Soviet military a shackle of the party. The contrast in supply lines and the quality of life showed the difference between a military that travels on its stomach and one that starves on its pride. In the US, the logistics revolution meant that even in the middle of a desert, an American soldier had access to high-quality MREs, meals ready to eat, clean water, specialized cold weather gear, and a logistics chain that treated their comfort as a strategic necessity. The American system understood that a miserable soldier is an ineffective soldier. In the USSR, logistics was a secondary concern to firepower, resulting in a reality where soldiers were often forced to steal food from local populations, wear boots that rotted their feet, and sleep in unheated tents in the middle of a Siberian winter. This systemic neglect wasn't a lack of resources. The USSR had enough steel to build 50,000 tanks. It was a lack of empathy, a belief that the Soviet soldier should be a stoic martyr who needed nothing but a crust of bread and a portrait of Lenin to win a war. The final contrast in this part is the return home and the social contract, which determined how a society healed after the uniform was taken off in the US. While the shadow of Vietnam was long, the 1980s saw the return of the Welcome Home parades and the GI Bill, which provided veterans with college education, low-interest mortgages, and a path to the middle class. The American system viewed the veteran as a hero to be reintegrated. In the USSR, the Afghansi, veterans of the Afghan War, returned to a country that didn't want to hear their stories, and a state that denied them medical benefits for their invisible psychological wounds. They were the forgotten victims of a forgotten war, often left to struggle with PTSD and disability in a society that was already falling apart. A difference that proved the US military was a community of honor, while the Soviet military was a machine of extraction, taking the best years and the health of its youth and giving them nothing but a rusted medal and a lifetime of silence in return. The psychological mobilization of the civilian population was the most insidious front of the Cold War, a process of turning every school, factory, and home into a secondary trench. In the United States, the military-industrial complex was a subject of intense public debate, with Eisenhower himself warning against its overreach, and the culture remained fundamentally civilian-led, with the military serving as a shield that was out of sight but always ready. American society was built on the pursuit of happiness, not the preparation for death, and the Cold War was something people watched on the news while they built businesses and families. In the USSR, militarism was the state religion, a cult of the great victory that was used to justify the eternal poverty of the present. Every child was taught to view the world through a rifle scope, and the boundary between civilian and military was intentionally erased. This total militarization of the mind meant that the Soviet citizen lived in a state of permanent mobilization, where the lack of butter was excused by the production of guns, a difference that turned the US into a society that had an army, while the USSR was an army that had a country. The contrast in nuclear preparedness and the cult of the bunker revealed two different ways of facing the apocalypse. In the US, civil defense was a decentralized and often community-led effort, with fallout shelter signs becoming a part of the urban landscape. But the primary focus was on deterrence and diplomacy to ensure the bombs were never dropped. The American public was terrified of nuclear war, and that fear fueled a massive peace movement that forced the government to negotiate arms reduction treaties. In the USSR, nuclear war was treated as a winnable tactical scenario. The state built massive, deep underground bunkers for the party elite, while providing the common people with nothing but civil defense days where they practiced running into subways with wet rags over their faces. This cynical hierarchy of survival showed that the Soviet state was prepared to sacrifice 90% of its population to ensure the survival of the bureaucracy, a difference in the value of human life that made the American approach one of prevention and the Soviet approach one of calculated mass sacrifice. The role of the paranoia of encirclement versus the strategy of containment defined the global footprint of both superpowers. In the US, military strategy was based on containment, building a global network of alliances like NATO to prevent the spread of totalitarianism, a doctrine that relied on collective security and economic partnership, where the presence of American bases was often a negotiated agreement with sovereign nations. In the USSR, the military strategy was one of the buffer zone, a paranoid belief that the motherland could only be safe if it occupied and dominated every neighbor from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. This was an imperialism of fear, where the Soviet Army acted as an occupying force in its own allies' territories, ready to crush any democratic movement with tanks, as seen in Prague and Budapest. A difference that made the US a leader of a coalition and the USSR a jailer of a satellite empire. The contrast in military science and the theft of genius showed how the two systems utilized their best minds. In the US, military research was often the engine of civilian progress, with inventions like the internet, GPS, and jet engines quickly flowing into the private sector to create new industries and jobs. The American system recycled military innovation for civilian wealth. In the USSR, the military was an intellectual black hole, where the most brilliant physicists, mathematicians, and engineers were locked in closed cities and forced to work on weapons that had zero application for the public good. While an American scientist could win a Nobel Prize and start a tech giant, a Soviet scientist was a state secret who lived in a gilded cage, producing missiles for a country that couldn't produce a reliable washing machine. A tragic waste of human potential that ensured the Soviet economy remained a technological desert with nuclear oases. The final contrast in this part is the parade versus the reality, the visual lie that eventually collapsed under its own weight. In the US, military power was often understated in public life, with no massive tanks rolling through Washington, D.C. on a regular basis, because the strength of the nation was visible in its economic and cultural dominance. The American military didn't need to perform for its citizens. Its power was a fact of life. In the USSR, the military parade on Red Square was a desperate theatrical performance, a way to distract the people from the empty shelves and the crumbling infrastructure by showing them rows of shiny missiles and goose-stepping soldiers. This mask of strength hid a military that was rotting from within, plagued by alcoholism, corruption, and a total lack of morale. A difference that meant when the real crisis came, the American system was a solid block of granite, while the Soviet system was a hollow statue of rusted iron, ready to shatter at the first true blow. The terminal collapse of the Soviet Union was the ultimate proof that a nation cannot be held together by bayonets alone, especially when the hands holding those bayonets are tired, hungry, and disillusioned. In the United States, the 1980s military buildup under Reagan was a strategic masterpiece that forced the USSR into an arms race it couldn't afford. But it was supported by a booming civilian economy that turned military spending into technological leadership. The American system demonstrated that true strength is a byproduct of liberty, and that a free people will always outproduce and out-innovate a conscripted one. In the USSR, the military had become a parasite that had finally killed its host, consuming nearly 20% of the GDP, while the people stood in lines for bread. This over-militarization led to a systemic heart attack, where the state had the world's largest nuclear arsenal but couldn't provide its citizens with soap or light bulbs, a difference that proved the US was a civilization with a sword, while the USSR was just a warehouse of weapons surrounded by a starving crowd. The contrast in the crisis of legitimacy and the refusal to fire revealed the moment the Soviet soldiers ceased to be a tool of the party. In the US, the military's role in domestic affairs was strictly limited by law, ensuring that the army remained a source of national pride rather than a source of domestic fear. The American soldier knew their duty was to protect the people, not to oppress them. In the USSR, the state's final desperate attempt to save itself involved sending tanks against its own citizens in cities like Vilnius and Tbilisi. But the chain of obedience finally snapped as young conscripts, broken by years of Dedovshchina and lies, refused to fire on their own mothers and brothers standing in the streets. This was the ultimate moral bankruptcy of the system. The moment the Red Army realized it had no enemy left to fight, except the very people it was supposed to represent, a difference that meant the American system was sustained by the consent of the governed, while the Soviet system collapsed the moment the fear vanished. The role of the military industry's toxic legacy left a scar on the earth that will take centuries to heal. In the US, the transition away from the Cold War involved a massive effort to decontaminate military sites and repurpose defense laboratories for civilian science, a process of beating swords into plowshares that was monitored by environmental agencies and the public. The American system took responsibility for its military footprint in the USSR. The retreating army left behind a landscape of poison and rust, from abandoned nuclear submarines rotting in Arctic bays to soil saturated with toxic rocket fuel in every republic. The Soviet military was a scorched earth machine that treated its own territory like a conquered land, leaving the successor states with $1 trillion cleanup bill and a health crisis that continues to kill more people than any war. A difference that proves the US viewed its land as a home, while the USSR viewed it as a disposable firing range. The contrast in the professional soldier versus the traumatized veteran continues to define the social fabric of the two nations. In the US, the veterans of the Cold War era became leaders in business, politics, and technology, utilized by a society that valued their discipline and skills, creating a veteran class that remains a pillar of American stability. The American system recycled its warriors into citizens. In the former Soviet space, the Afghanistan and the veterans of a broken system became a lost generation, often marginalized, untreated for PTSD, and forced into the world of organized crime just to survive the chaotic 90s. The Soviet state took the youth of its men and returned them as broken ghosts, leaving a legacy of violence and despair that fueled the social collapse of an entire continent. A difference in human investment that ensured the US remained a land of builders, while the post-Soviet world became a land of survivors. The final verdict on the military Cold War is that the United States won because it understood that morale is a function of freedom, and that a soldier who fights for his home is more powerful than a soldier who fights for a slogan. The Soviet Union was a 70-year experiment in the industrialization of courage, an attempt to build a global empire on the broken backs of its own youth, and its collapse was a victory for the human spirit over the machinery of death. The American system was a shield of liberty that grew stronger through the prosperity of its people. The Soviet system was a scythe of ideology that grew duller as it cut deeper into its own flesh. And the end of the Cold War was the moment the world realized that you cannot win a war against the future if you are holding your own people hostage in the past. A reminder that the most powerful weapon any nation possesses is not the missile in the silo, but the dignity of the man in the uniform. What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital or the existence of the secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.